streaming the Mehalshick files over the last several months, and they're on our app right now. You'll see a lot of the stories I focus on are stories that were high profile, a lot of interest, shocking, disturbing, you name it, cases that got a lot of coverage, but also deserve maybe a second or third look, to look back at where are they now, some of the nuances in the investigations. My podcasts have included, as you know, if you check it out, The Mob in Northeastern PA, past and present, Cold Case, Kids for Cash, UFO sightings over Pennsylvania, and a whole list of other cases that we're taking a deeper dive in. And that's what the Mehalshick files are all about. Today, we're talking about the case of the murder of Robert Curley of Wilkes-Barre back in 1991. His wife, Joanne Curley, pled guilty to poisoning him slowly and methodically, causing his death. Again, he died in 1991. We'll talk about that case. She pled guilty to third-degree murder, served time. She's now released from prison. But the case really today, you mentioned the name Bob Curley and thallium poisoning. People in Northeastern PA remember it, and if you Google it, you'll see a gazillion stories, just too many even to count. And of course, this reporter at 2822 News did extensive coverage over the years. Dramatic every step of the way. And today I'm fortunate and so happy to say that I have the man who prosecuted the case, former Luzerne County District Attorney Peter Paul Olszewski, joins us here in our 2822 Now studio. Peter, thank you for joining us here today.
Hi, Andy. Always great to be with you.
And, you know, we're laughing because before we went to start streaming, we do this podcast, we were talking that Pete and I go so far back, it might be illegal. But number two, I probably have interviewed Peter Paul Olszewski, no kidding, more than anybody else in my career, 45, 50 years, because he's been a prosecutor, but also involved in so many cases and stories after even he left public office. But Peter Paul, you know, we talk about, and you know, the fact of the matter is, and we also talked to the sister of Robert Curley. Mm-hmm. Her interview is coming up shortly. She'll be talking about how that horrible death of Bob Curley because of thallium poisoning is still haunting her and her family. And I guess her mom and dad and family passed away, and knowing with that pain. So very quickly, Pete, just some of your background bio. I know that's at length. We only have an hour. So just some of your background, how you became Luzerne County DA, and then a judge after that.
Sure. I graduated from law school in 1984, came to Wilkes-Barre, and was in the general practice of law. In 1986, I was fortunate to become an assistant district attorney of Luzerne County for 2 years. And in 1991, I ran for the office of district attorney. I was elected in 91 and reelected again in 1995. So I had a great 8 years as the DA of Luzerne County. Was really a hands-on prosecutor. I tried a lot of cases in the courtroom. And then in 1999, I was fortunate to be elected judge of the Court of Common Pleas of Luzerne County. I was on the bench for 10 years, serving 9 of those 10 years in the criminal division. I retired in 2009, and I've been in private practice with my wife, attorney Melissa Scartelli, for the past 15 years now, doing medical malpractice and personal injury cases and some criminal defense work as well.
You know, it's interesting, Peter Paul, when you look back at your legal career and the depth of it. So you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. But this case of Bob Curley, we're going to run several stories that we did back in the day. But just a brief synopsis, this Bob Curley poisoning, she pled guilty to third-degree murder.
Correct.
Give us the basic facts of the case.
Well, back in, actually the facts begin before I was elected DA. The case began in August of 1991. Bob Curley was married to Joanne Curley. They resided in Wilkes-Barre. He was an electrician for Morgan Electric. And in August of 1991, he began working on a remodeling of the chemistry lab at Wilkes University. And shortly after that, he became rather ill with a number of symptoms, including awful abdominal pain, vomiting, nauseousness. He was admitted to the Wilkes-Barre General Hospital for 2 separate stays, totaling about 3 weeks. His symptoms continued to deteriorate. He was diagnosed initially by Wilkes-Barre General as having Guillain-Barré syndrome, which was not the correct diagnosis. His family then, most importantly his sister and mother, insisted that he be transferred to the Hershey Medical Center, which is a leading poison control center in Pennsylvania. He was there for 10 days. His health continued to deteriorate, and it wasn't until 2 days before his death that Hershey finally diagnosed him as suffering from thallium poisoning. Thallium is a heavy metal. In the 1940s, 50s, it was the principal ingredient in rat poison. And in the late 60s, the EPA actually banned thallium from being used in rat poison because too many young children were accidentally poisoning themselves,
Getting near it, right.
getting the rat poison, eating it, and dying. And in any event, about 2 days after the diagnosis at Hershey, Bob died an awful, painful, terrible death because he passed in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. Dauphin County coroner had jurisdiction. They did an autopsy, which ultimately was horribly incomplete, inadequate, unprofessional. It was about 3 weeks later. So the law enforcement investigation into the homicide of Bob Curley didn't begin for 3 weeks after his death. Obviously, in 99.9% of our homicide investigations, they begin immediately. And there was this 3-week delay, and off the investigation went. And in January 6th of 1992, I came into office. I was sworn into office, and sitting there was an unsolved open homicide case.
And I remember, Pete, when you came into office, and we had been talking to Bob Curley's friends and family, and they felt no one was coming right out and saying, we think Joanne Curley has something to do with it. But they had suspicions that there was something not right here. He was a healthy guy. They just didn't believe it was a medical death, that it was, even before he died, that why is he sick? They felt something was wrong, but they didn't know where to go about it. Excuse me. We're going to run a package on, because there's so many twists and turns with this story. And I know there's been a lot of national attention over it. And correct me if I'm wrong, this thallium poisoning with this case, wasn't this one of the first nationwide? It caught the attention of investigators all over the country. There was one, I think, one or two in Florida at the time. Do you remember? This is one of the leading cases of thallium that really caught the attention and say, hey, this kind of stuff is going on, or could be happening in your area.
It was one of the first thallium poisoning cases in the United States, but it was, in fact, the second case ever to utilize a toxicology procedure known as segmental analysis. It was a new toxicology procedure where toxicologists, if they had hair samples or fingernail samples from the deceased, they would be able, and thallium is a heavy metal, that's the type of element it is, toxicologists would be able to detect the presence of thallium in the victim's fingernails or hair samples, and two, they would then be able to determine how many times the person ingested thallium, and number three, would be able to actually put a date on each ingestion based upon the growth rate of the hair or the nails.
And it's amazing. And that was, again, back in the 90s. I
Correct.
can't even imagine now what the technology will show. Let's run one of our initial stories. This Joy Nardone, our producer. Let's run the story we did when Joanne Curley was arrested. We'll listen to it, Pete, and we'll comment. Again, so many twists and turns. There was an exclamation involved here, all kind of things. And there's a lot to talk about. Let's show that first package of him at her arrest, Joey. Joanne Curley is brought to magistrate's court, handcuffed in the back of a state police cruiser. A mob of reporters and onlookers surround the car, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman police say killed her husband in cold blood. Investigators say Joanne Curley systematically poisoned her husband with thallium, a chemical once used to make rat poison.
The affidavit indicates that this has been a long-term exposure, beginning in October, November of 1990.
It allegedly continued for the next 11 months until Curley died a horrible, painful death in September of 1991. Detectives always suspected that somebody was spiking Curley's iced tea with thallium, but where and how? Much focus was placed on Curley's co-workers. It turned out Curley may have provided the answers when his body was exhumed in 1994. Sophisticated tests pointed the finger of blame directly at his widow.
That investigation, including the sophisticated forensic analysis, leads to the inescapable conclusion that today's action is appropriate and warranted.
Police say Joanne Curley spiked her husband's iced tea containers and even gave him a dose while he lay dying in the hospital. Arrest papers indicate that he knew something was happening. 5 days before he died, he grabbed a nurse by the arm and pleaded, "Please help me. My wife is trying to kill me. She is not as she seems." The prosecution says it will seek the death penalty for Joanne Curley. In Luzerne County, Andy Mehalshick, 28 Eyewitness News, Sunrise. Okay, a very young Peter Polishevsky and a really young Andy Mehalshick. We're about the same age, so. But you look back at that, when you think about it, and all the details, Pete, start coming back. You know, talking to the nurse in the hospital, he knew something was wrong there. But no one, at that point, you're saying investigators really didn't pick up on it, correct? I think the family had suspicions, and we're going to hear from Bob Curley's sister in a little bit. They suspected her as time moved on. But what's your reaction when you see that story?
Well, it obviously brings back a lot of memories about the investigation and the entire process. You know, you're right. From the word go, since the date of Bob's passing, many family members and friends always suspected that Joanne was involved. But the problem, however, is murder suspects can't be arrested based upon a neighbor's suspicion. We need evidence. And initially, investigators were thrown a terrible curveball by the medical staff at Hershey Medical Center. I went down and I personally spoke to at length with the chief pathologist, the chief toxicologist, and Bob's treating physician. And the investigators and I interviewed them for hours. And their unanimous, strong, unwaverable conclusion is that A, Bob Curley certainly was never poisoned here at the Hershey Medical Center. He was never poisoned at Wilkes-Barre General Hospital. And we believe he was only given one dose of thallium. All that information was 100% wrong, false, and incorrect. But at the time, they were the people treating Bob. They were the people who had watched him, treated him, analyzed him in the hospital, and investigators were obviously led to believe that those were the correct facts in the case, and they weren't.
We're going to take a short break, Peter Polishevsky. We're talking about the poisoning death in 1991 of Robert Curley of Wilkes-Barre. And you'll see a lot of video running different company. When he worked at a company, you'll see the arrest, the exhumation video. There's so many moving parts to this ongoing story, but still, it's part of it's a sad story in northeastern Pennsylvania. And his family is still dealing with it, of course. And I always tell a lot of our younger reporters, Peter, Paul, and you as a prosecutor, I'm sure you have conversation with your prosecutors as well over the years, that while the case may be moved away and we move on to a point, we never forget, we move on to other stories. These kind of murders happen, those families' lives are changed forever. They'll never have their loved one around a table again.
It's an indelible mark
right.
On the family. Bob Curley was loved by every one of them, by his sister, by his brother, by his mother, and they all witnessed Bob die a horrible, terrible, painful, excruciatingly painful death. And it's something that they unfortunately will endure forever. Okay,
Peter Polishevsky, attorney Peter Polishevsky, former Luzerne County District Attorney, who really took this investigation by the bull by the horns and pushed it forward. We'll talk more about the investigation. We have a lot to talk about. We'll show you some more packages back from throughout the years on the Bob Curley investigation, poisoned by his wife, Joanne Curley, who pled guilty and served time in prison. Joe Nardone, my director, producer, let's take a short break. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to this edition of the Mehalshick Files on the 2822 Now app. We're talking today about the murder, the brutal murder of Bob Curley of Wilkes-Barre back in 1991 by his wife. She didn't beat him or stab him or shoot him. She poisoned him to death with thallium, spiking his iced tea. He died a slow, horrible death. And we're talking to the man, the former Luzerne County District Attorney, who came into the case really, was already in motion, and took over the case in 1992 when he became District Attorney. Peter Polashevsky, you and I have covered, I'm going to say, hundreds of cases. Not all murders, but many of them murders. When you came into office, I remember back then, we won't mention names of families and all, but there were 2 or 3 murders that happened like almost every weekend in January of 1992. And again, folks, murders back in Luzerne County and in NEPA in general, they were few and far between.
Right.
But you had like 2 or 3 murders already in progress, and this case was still hanging out there.
It was unbelievable. The day I took office, this Bob Curley case, of course, was totally unsolved. A murder case from the city of Wilkes-Barre against a gentleman by the name of O'Boyle, who was convicted of first-degree murder of his mother, was reversed and needed to be retried.
And that was in North Wilkes-Barre, correct?
That was a Wilkes-Barre City.
Up on Washington Street or something
Exactly
like that?
right. Exactly right.
I'm like a new savant. My family says, don't talk about it anymore, Dad, or my wife, because these cases are so horrible, they just stand out.
That was Joseph O'Boyle,
Yep.
who killed his mother by stomping her to death with his work boots. We then had a terrible shooting homicide in the back mountain in Dallas, where we had a suspect at large and the use of a SWAT team to take him into
the
custody
hotel.
and try him. A fellow by the name of Schwartz, Stephen Schwartz. I personally tried that case and got a first-degree murder conviction. And then shortly after that, we had the Todd Ray Tarselli case. At Kentucky Fried Chicken in Hazleton.
In that case, truth be told, I almost stopped. I live in my hometown's Hazleton. I almost stopped in on Kentucky Fried Chicken that night to get a late night snack. It was right before it closed, and it was too late. And I thought, well, it's already 10:15 or 9:30, whatever, and we just kept on going. The next morning, I found out that Mark Bunchak had been murdered by Todd Ray Tarselli.
Right.
And anyway, you talk about time, you just never know. That's why I always say, I'm not paranoid, I'm just realistic. You gotta keep your head on the swivel. And that's what makes the Bob Curley case even more tragic and sad. You expect to go home, you live on Cleveland Street, right? And he's drinking iced tea that his wife's packing his lunch or whatever, and she's poisoning him with that. Expound on that. What would she do?
Well, what she would do is the home she lived in, she had inherited from her grandfather, and it was in the Miners Mills section of Wilkes-Barre. And back in those times, there was a rat problem in that section of the city. And her grandfather had rat poison in the basement, and ultimately that was the source of the thallium that she used to kill her husband, number one. And what happened is ultimately the investigators seized the thermoses and lunchbox that Bob would take to work on a daily basis, and the crime lab, the Penn State Police crime lab, detected the presence of thallium around the brim of Bob's thermos that he used every day with iced tea. So the first premise then by the investigators is the vehicle to poison Bob was the thermos and in his tea. But they all worked from the premise that it was one ingestion. And that was completely false and untrue. And it was based on the information from Bob's medical providers in Hershey. It wasn't until I engaged Michael Bodden. Michael Bodden is, at that time, and still is, the world's most preeminent forensic pathologist. He's in New York City. I went to visit with Mike, with our team of investigators. He immediately asked if there were hair and fingernail samples from the initial autopsy, and there were not. And he said, without those samples, forensic analysis would be virtually impossible. So that required an exhumation of Bob. About 2 years after his death, we got court approval, got a court order. We brought Michael Bodden in to oversee the exhumation and the re-autopsy. We brought in the country's foremost forensic toxicologist, Fred Reeders from Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. They did the autopsy together. Mike was successful in getting the hair and nail samples. He was also successful in getting specimens of Bob's GI tract, his intestinal tract, and when those specimens went to Willow Grove, Dr. Reeders found not only the presence of thallium, he found that there had been multiple, 11 different ingestions over a period of about 11 months, with in multiple ingestions while Bob was a patient at Wilkes-Barre General Hospital, and a final ingestion while he was a patient at Hershey Medical Center. Unbelievable.
She wanted him dead.
She wanted him
And the
dead.
motive was money, right? Life insurance?
A $300,000 life insurance
So
policy.
what price you put on someone who trusts you and loves you? $300,000.
$300,000.
It could be like $1 billion. It doesn't matter.
Right.
You know, and then we're going to run Peter Paul another story from back in the day. We did so many, so we tried to pick out several stories we did as this case worked its way forward. We just looked at the arrest case. Joey Nardone, let's run the update package, okay? Joanne Curley had the motive and opportunity to kill her husband, so say prosecutors. Justice Martin Cain agreed and sent her on to trial. Police have always said that she poisoned her husband Robert with thallium to collect some $296,000 in insurance money. Today, State Police Detective Robert McBride testified how they eliminated 25 other potential suspects, narrowing the field to those who had easy access to Robert Curley, both at home and at the hospital. That person, Joanne Curley. In a 1994 interview, he told Curley, "This eliminates everyone else but you." Curley, "Oh, my, isn't that interesting?" McBride, "If everyone else is eliminated, who does that leave?" Curley responded, "I don't know. I know what you're thinking, but I didn't kill him. I didn't do anything." McBride also testified about a possible source of the thallium. Detectives learned about a jug of rat poison that Joanne Curley apparently had access to at her grandmother's home, located next to the Curley home on Cleveland Street. Curley's home was searched from top to bottom in October of 1991, but thallium was never found. Today, Robert Curley's family leaves the hearing with some sort of relief.
We're pleased with the results.
For now, Joanne Curley will remain behind bars pending a bail hearing. She does face a death penalty if convicted. And without a doubt, most courthouse observers agree that this could be one of the most sensational cases ever held in the area. In Luzerne County, Andy Mehalshick, 28 Eyewitness News. Well, little did we know, we hear about sensational, not because sensational in a good way, but just the details. Every story we look back at, and I'll be honest with you, it's bringing back memories of the details. And the arrest affidavit, the testimony, the preliminary hearing was so detailed. Let me tell you, this guy doesn't mess around. I mean, and I say that in a positive way because I've seen you operate and prosecute so many cases over the years. But this one, to come into office in January, it's already out there smoldering. Maybe, as you said, things being lost, not being done correctly, whatever, and to pick it up and get her to plead guilty, that's amazing in my opinion. So what did you think when you see that package, when you see the testimony in that preliminary hearing?
Right. We engaged a second world-renowned forensic pathologist from Pittsburgh, Dr. Cyril Wecht. Both Dr. Bodden and Wecht served on the Warren Commission who investigated the assassination of President Kennedy. And our plan was we hired both of them so the defense couldn't hire either. And I ultimately used Dr. Wecht to testify at the preliminary hearing where the charges were bound over, knowing that I would not call him at the trial, and instead we would use Dr. Bodden as our principal forensic expert at the trial. That was some good planning and great work by those pathologists. I think too that keep in mind what threw investigators, in addition to not having the hair and nail samples, by being misled by the medical persons.
Joanne wasn't intentional.
No, it wasn't intentional. It was just they were wrong.
And because this was something so new, I'm not going to make excuses for them, but
Right.
it was something so new. You could almost see what happened, but then again, wasn't handled the right way.
Right. And then, so ultimately, the investigators went from believing that there was one ingestion to now having scientific evidence that there were multiple ingestions over an 11-month period. That changed everything. In your typical homicide investigation, the investigators follow the evidence, develop a suspect, and then develop evidence to prove whether the suspect is guilty or not. In this case, we had to do the opposite. We had to determine who was guilty by way of excluding people. So we had to take all the people who had contact with Bob Curley during that 11-month period and slowly and methodically exclude them. And ultimately, when Bob was a patient at the Wilkes-Barre General Hospital, we knew he was poisoned there. So we had to find out and determine how many people saw him, who they were, and see who we could eliminate. And then we knew that he was also poisoned at the Hershey Medical Center. So once again, the investigators determined every single person who came into contact with Bob at the Hershey Medical Center. And then we looked at, well, was there anybody who had contact with him at both facilities, at Hershey, at General, and earlier on in the earlier poisonings? And at the end of the day, we excluded everybody but one
Joanne
person.
Curley. And truth be told, we talked about this before we went to stream this podcast, was when this case started developing, the family started calling for a police investigation. There was some kind of discussion or controversy in the beginning when there was not an immediate police investigation, and the family would be calling us saying, "We think something's wrong." They didn't say Joanne. They said, "My brother died. Can you guys look into it?" They called here. I was in the newsroom. They called me, and I said, "Well, we'll check into it." Again, we didn't really know much about it. We had heard about this, but unlike today with social media, where there's bullhorns out there, people would go screaming from the top of the mountains and get your attention. Back then, it was if you would get a phone call or a tip off, or know the family, how would you know?
Right.
It could be natural causes. That night, after we started looking into it, I had called Joanne Curley on a landline phone, right? She answered the phone. I called the house. She answered the phone. I said, "I'm so-and-so. I'm sorry for your loss." She was very, seemed like upset, not crying and stuff, but just very solemn. And I said, can I talk to you tomorrow? As this case was starting to unfold, I said, "Can I come down up to your home in Cleveland Street and talk to you about this case, and what do you think happened?" And she said, "No, I really don't want to talk about it now. I'm too upset." It was like about a 5-minute conversation. I'm paraphrasing now. And that was it. But no one, I think at that point in the early days, no one really thought it would be an inside job, your wife.
Another initial problem is that during the very early stage of the investigation, before I came into office, the investigators had essentially dismissed her as the suspect. And she was not a suspect. And the investigators were focused, unfortunately, on Bob's coworkers from Wilkes University. And those guys, unfortunately, went under a lot of pressure, a lot of scrutiny for quite a while, unnecessarily. And ultimately, we proved that they were not responsible.
We're going to talk about that because he was working for Morgan Electric, a still established company, and he was working in a chem lab at Wilkes University or college at the time. And then it was almost by dumb luck was happening then. I don't think she knew. Did Joanne Curley plan it that way? Probably not. But ironically, he was working with other people in a lab, and there was joke that maybe someone played a practical joke on the guy. On Bob Curley. Okay, we're going to take a short break. We'll come back more with Peter Polashevsky, and we're going to hear from Susan Curley Grady, Bob Curley's sister. Joe Nardone, take it away. Welcome back. You're watching the Mehalshick Files. Andy Mehalshick, lead live team reporter here at 2822 News. We're talking about the case that gained nationwide attention, still talked about, especially in northeastern Pennsylvania, the thallium poisoning of Robert Curley by his wife, Joanne Curley. My special guest today, and I'm so honored to have you in our studio, Attorney Peter Polashevsky, who was the Luzerne County District Attorney at the time, who really came in on the case as it was already unfolding. We'll talk more with Peter Paul momentarily, but I also interviewed Bob Curley's sister, Susan Curley Grady, recently about the case. Again, he died in 1991, so you're talking 34, 35 years ago. Here's how that interview went with Susan. First of all, what do you remember about that time? After all these years, Joanne Curley served her time, the investigation, that kind of thing. What are you thinking about today when you think about that situation and your brother?
The thing that hurts me the most is watching Bobby suffer with the pain. He was in excruciating pain, and we just had to watch him. There was absolutely nothing we can do. And yet someone who did this to him knew exactly what was going on.
And Joanne Curley, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Joanne Curley, didn't she give him a lethal, what turned out to be the final dose of thallium at the hospital on food or pizza when the family was even nearby? In other words, she wanted to make sure he died?
Yes. She, kept giving him small doses to see what it would do to his body, apparently. Now, the final dose, it was a Sunday afternoon, and my brother David and his friend was there. I was there with my husband, and Joanne was there at the hospital. She actually waited until we all left the hospital, and then what she had admitted to was she went and got a soda from the vending machine. She took it back into his room, mixed the poison in, and gave him the poison to drink, made him drink it, and then threw the rest of the soda in the trash bin and went home and never looked back.
When did you realize, in the very beginning, and even as a reporter covering this, there was so much speculation and where he worked, and he was at the university, and at Wilkes he was working in a lab, and there was all kinds of speculation. When did you realize, did you always suspect her, or when did you realize this is homegrown murder?
We first realized that something was totally wrong with her attitude. It got very, very distant. She actually would come up to our house, my mother's house, and she sat and had dinner with us. And just the attitude from her, we felt something was wrong. We couldn't prove it, but we felt something was wrong. It was December 18th of that year, 1991. We went out for dinner. It was my mother's birthday. We came back to the house to have cake, and she and my other sister-in-law, Nancy Curley, were sitting at the kitchen table, and myself and David and Mom were sitting on a chair in the room. And the conversation did not go well. And they said, "Do you think Joanne did this?" And we all, my mother, myself, and my brother looked at each other, and we wanted to say yes, but we didn't say yes. And they knew something was wrong, and my sister-in-law, the two of them, walked out of the room, and I never saw them again. And we knew from then on it was her.
Again, looking back now, she served her time. She's out there on the street now. Does your family have any closure? Have you ever received any closure at all, or any peace at all?
Well, there's never any closure on a death of someone when you love someone. And the way that Bobby died, there's never going to be closure on it completely. Was justice served? No. She intentionally did this over a period of time and watched him suffer. That's the hard part, is watching someone suffer and there's nothing you can do about it. She could have done something about it. She could have stopped even doing it. And she didn't. She just kept giving it and giving it to him and making it worse and worse. The poor guy, he used to cry with pain. You couldn't even touch his hand to console him because he hurt so much with pain. And the only one that knew really what was going on was her, and she kept doing it.
And Susan, one last question. I remember there's so much information. It was so long ago, but a lot of the details and stories are still fresh in my mind as well. I had read somewhere or heard somewhere where, did Bob, your brother, say to somebody she's not, meaning referencing Joanne, when he was in the hospital, or that she's not what she appears to be? Did he suspect something?
That was, I think, the last dose that she gave him in the hospital. He knew something was wrong. I think he saw her put it in the drink, and then, she made him drink it. And I think at that point, he knew something was wrong. And that's when he told a nurse. I was gone already from the hospital, but I think he told a nurse, that he knew something was definitely wrong.
Okay, Susan Curley Grady, thank you very much for your time, and hope somehow your family gets peace and you get closure somewhere soon, or if ever.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for always caring and covering this story, because we do want Bobby's memory to stay alive in the community.
Okay, Joan Nardone brings us a high five. The high sign. Now, you could still hear the pain in her voice, Peter Paul, after all these years. And truth be told, she said she wanted to talk about it. Not that she was hesitating to do it, but she said, I still have all this pain after all these years. So, as life goes on, we never forget, but the families who are impacted by these cases, especially this one, you're supposed to feel safe at home. And that's where she was doing most of the spiking, correct?
Right.
In the kitchen, probably.
Yeah, it was done when she put the rat poison in his tea, and he drank it when he was at work, or he drank it wherever. But the iced tea and the thermos were the medium used to transfer. So yeah, and it was a horrible, 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 painful death, as Susan said, and something just virtually impossible for close family members to forget.
Now, I also understand, if I remember correctly, you did testing on his daughter at the time.
We did.
Wasn't it found in her system and the daughter and Joanne Curley's system?
Correct.
Was that purposely done that way, or do you think she just cross-contaminated?
Well, number one, what we know for sure is that we had our investigators take samples and test both Joanne and the young 10-year-old daughter for the presence of thallium. Both of those individuals, in fact, had thallium in their system. Our conclusion was that the presence in Joanne was based upon her handling of the rat poison itself and putting it into the tea. We believe that she actually intentionally gave her daughter some rat poison to try to evade suspicion by the investigators that because she would never ever poison her own daughter.
Right.
That was simply false and untrue. But yes, they both had thallium in their systems.
And now to go back to Bob Curley, who was an electrician, and I'm told a really, really good one, working at Wilkes University in the lab. They were doing remodeling work, and we all heard about that. Initially, it was a practical joke done by one of his coworkers, spiking his iced tea at work. Expound on that a little bit. And that turned out not to be true, but ironically, the timing was unbelievable.
That took place before I was in office. But what essentially happened is investigators knew that he was working at the chemistry lab at Wilkes. They went to the chemistry lab and in fact found thallium at the lab. Now, you just don't find thallium in any place. You don't go to Walmart and buy thallium. It was in fact in that laboratory, and therefore they believed that the thallium in the lab was the source of the thallium that killed Bob.
Initially.
The question then became, if in fact it was the source, how did he come to ingest it? And the investigators at that time, the early investigators, did not believe that any co-workers intentionally put thallium in Bob's tea, but they learned through interviews that Bob was a practical joker. And Bob would do practical jokes on his coworkers at work, and in return, they would do practical jokes on him. And one of the theories that the investigators hypothesized was this a joke gone bad? Did the coworkers find the stallium, not realize what it was? Maybe it had a funny taste to it. Put it in Bob's tea, had him drink it, spit it out.
Got a good laugh.
They had a laugh at that. He had some, something in his tea, and ultimately that was the one ingestion that killed him. Well, obviously we know that wasn't true. It wasn't one ingestion that killed him, number one, and number two, it wasn't the thallium from the lab that he ingested, and number three, his coworkers had absolutely zero to do with this crime. So it did throw investigators, the fact that there was thallium in the lab did throw investigators a curveball, which led them in a direction which ultimately ended and was incorrect.
And maybe the timing for her, again, when did they believe that she started actually spiking his iced tea? I read some reports like in late 1990, like 8 or 9 months, 10 months beforehand.
Correct. It really didn't become obvious until we did the exhumation and Dr. Reeders did the toxicology testing, and the testing showed that there was a methodical series of 11 poisonings over a lengthy period of time that definitively included poisonings in both Wilkes-Barre General and Hershey Medical Centers. At that point, she obviously was the focus of the investigation, and our job at that point was to exclude everybody else.
And it's interesting, again, we're talking about especially the last lethal dose given at Hershey. She had to suspect by that time something was going to happen. And correct me if I'm wrong, once you have thallium poisoning, you really can't survive that. Even if she didn't give that lethal dose, she probably would have died anyway.
Correct. I mean,
it's like radiation poisoning. You get so much, you die.
Keep in mind that he had in fact been diagnosed finally 2 days before with thallium poisoning.
Before the final dose.
Yes. So the medical staff was aware that thallium was killing him, and that was an issue because at that point they had no remedy available to save Bob. So whether he would have died without that final one, probably yes. But
at least there was hope. If she didn't give him that final dose in the hospital, you never know.
We know that she did it. We told her she did it, and ultimately, as a result of the plea, she admitted to doing it.
And we'll talk about the guilty plea when we come back. We're going to take a short break. You're watching the Mehalshick Files. My special guest today, attorney Peter Polashevsky, former Luzerne County DA and former Luzerne County judge who prosecuted Joanne Curley for the poisoning death of her husband, Bob Curley, back in 1991. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back to the Mehalshick Files on 2822 Now app. We're streaming we're talking today about the Bob Curley poisoning at the hands of his wife, Joanne Curley, who served time in prison. She was released like 9 years ago. My special guest today, attorney Peter Polashevsky. We have about 5 minutes left total. Let's run Joey, the story we did when she was released from prison, which came about, we were keeping an eye on it, but it happened like late at night. She was released from prison. Run that package.
Justice was not served with Joanne, but someday she will meet her maker and justice will be served.
Susan Curley Grady says 20 years behind bars was not enough punishment for the slow, painful death her brother Robert endured at the hands of Joanne Curley. This is a photograph of Curley leaving a state prison near Erie just after midnight. She has a hood over her face. It ends a bizarre story that began back in 1991 when she laced her husband's iced tea with rat poison. She was arrested in 1996, and as I reported then, she said she wasn't guilty. The prosecution says it will seek the death penalty for Joanne Curley. But there would be no trial. She confessed to killing her husband, pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, and was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. At the time, the Curley family wanted closure.
A third degree was accepted. She told us how she killed Bobby, and we needed to have answers at that point.
The prosecution's case was largely based on scientific evidence collected during an exhumation of Curley's body 2 years after his death. It showed that he was poisoned over a long period of time. Former Luzerne County District Attorney Peter Polashevsky wanted a first-degree conviction and a possible death sentence, but back then had concerns about the science involved.
That type of toxicology testing was never before admitted in evidence in any Pennsylvania courtroom. So the question for us was whether or not, when we went through a hearing, the court would find that evidence reliable enough to be admitted.
Okay, Peter Polashevsky back in, that was, I believe, 2016.
I looked pretty good back then, huh?
You do? How come I always look so old? I don't understand. Look at video, I'm like a young kid, but look at me now. Peter Paul, but again, you talk about all the passage of this time, but still people talk about it. And now as we're talking about here on this podcast, we'll go back over the stories that we've done in other media and say, how could this happen? How could someone be so cold to poison her own husband? Someone, you're supposed to be safe at home. We're talking about the guilty plea. Again, you mentioned it in the package there. We have only a few minutes. Why take the guilty plea?
We were the team, the total investigation team. We were preparing for trial, and the defense, as expected, filed a challenge to the admissibility of the toxicology testing. That type of testing had never been admitted in Pennsylvania courtroom before, and more problematic is when Bob Curley was exhumed, his entire casket was filled with water. And so for a period of about 2 years, these hair and nail samples were submerged in water. And there was no ability to determine what effect that might have had on the evidence itself. So the concern out there was if this testing results don't get admitted into evidence, if it's suppressed, there's no case. And she walks with a not guilty verdict. While we were prepared to go to trial, we ultimately consulted with the Curley family, and that included his mother, his sister, his brother, and their counsel. And after lengthy discussions, I said to the family, I'll do what you want. If you want us to go to trial, we'll go to trial. The defense has offered us a plea of third-degree murder with a statutory maximum sentence of 20 years. We could take it, we could reject it and go to trial. And the family appreciated that gesture. They ultimately said they wanted closure, and they asked, could we get an interview with her where she admits truthfully to everything that happened? I was able to negotiate that with her counsel, and following her plea, she was interviewed, or prior to her plea, she was fully interviewed by me and the investigators. She admitted each and every step. She confirmed that our toxicology analysis was 100% accurate. She admitted to all those things, which gave the family a level of closure, and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and she served every single day of it.
It's interesting. We're going to be wrapping up now, Peter Polishevsky, but the fact that she admitted to, I've covered so many cases. You've, of course, prosecuted, presided over them as a judge. I think, and we've had tragedy in our family, you want to hear someone admit they did it.
Right.
That's almost not the most important thing, but if not the most important thing, pretty darn close. You want someone to say, I did it, and just admit to it.
And that's what Bob's mother wanted, first and foremost. And number two, the family, Bob's sister and brother were concerned about whether Mom would be able to make it through a 3-week trial of this nature.
Yeah. Okay, Attorney Peter Polishevsky, thank you so much for being part of our podcast today. There's so much more we can go into. We'll have you back. We'll talk about this case again and some other cases moving forward with our podcast because, you've, like I said, you've handled some really interesting, fascinating cases, both on the defense side and prosecution side. So thank you, Peter Polishevsky, for coming in today. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Again, watch our Mehalshick files, a whole bunch of stories in there that we've taken a deeper dive in over the last 35, 40, 45 years that I've covered Northeastern PA. For now, Andy Mehalshick, most importantly, have a safe day, and we'll see you later.
Welcome to Batya on News Nation. I'm Batya Ungar-Sargon, and we begin with what we learned about America this week.
Chris Steyerwalt, relief and despair today as police apprehend a suspect in a shooting at Brown University in Rhode Island after an overnight manhunt. While 10,000 miles away, a terror attack at a Hanukkah gathering in Australia carries grim implications for American Jews as they begin their own holiday observances. Meanwhile,